But your sweet spot, if I may put it this way, has always been late 19th, early 20th century and focused on Germany. What was it that inspired you to write this book about 1848?
Is this on? There we go. Yes, well, first of all, Peter, thank you very much for inviting me tonight, and thank you to the Society, and thank you to the Austrian Embassy for hosting this event this evening. I'm really delighted to be here. Yeah, I think I have been, as you say, I've been broadening, trying to broaden out. But I think there are lots of commonalities between this book and the Sleepwalkers, in the sense that I wanted to think and write about a piece of European history in a European way. Because there is a problem with the history of Europe, which is that it tends to have been hijacked by the nation states. And the nation states, created, in the case of the First World War, a series of silos of nation-state historiography, in which, by and large, they lined up like this. The people who wrote on Russia explained that Russia was completely innocent in the outbreak of the war. The people who wrote on France made the same claim for France. The people who wrote on Britain obviously said the same for Britain, and so it went on, Austria, Italy, and so on. Although the situation was rather more differentiated for Austria, whereas the German historians were very keen to say that Germans alone were responsible for the First World War. And what I was trying to do was to make sense of this war as an interlocking, as a European, a continental event, because it seemed to me that if we wanted to ask the question, even in a contemporary setting, how does peace become war? How does a war of great complexity and great destructive capacity break out? Then the answer probably isn't going to be because the Germans won one. It's going to be more complex than that. And the etiology of the First World War was exceptionally complex. And it seemed to me the more I looked into the story of how this war came about, the more active players there seemed to be, accumulating risks at various points in the system. So the idea was to Europeanize the story, not to as my sort of opponents often claim, especially in Germany, not to acquit the Germans of any responsibility for the outbreak of the war, but to think more about how war broke out and to look at the role played by all the powers in this horrific event, which involved everybody, with the exception, I think, of the Belgians. It would be crazy to blame the Belgians for the outbreak of the First World War, but we see very proactive and risk-generating policies amongst all the other players. And with 1848, it's a similar thing. Even 1848 fell under the shadow of the nation states. The story of 1848, which is experienced by contemporaries as a European event and a European experience. And you can see that if you look at contemporary press coverage. The horizon of information, the news horizon, is emphatically European. They're all looking to the very edges of the continent. They're looking at what's going on in Palermo, in Sicily, in Switzerland is very important, often overlooked, but extremely important. They have a civil war there in 1848, and they're putting this together in as part of a joined-up European picture. It's only in retrospect that the nation-state historiographical traditions pull this revolution apart into a set of discrete national stories. And what I wanted to do was to put these stories back together and tell this as and also analyze the underlying drivers of the narrative, but to frame it as a European event.
There are a number of themes there that I'd like to come back later in our discussion to, but could I just ask to begin with, as a layman, the idea of writing a 900-page book of history is almost inconceivable, given that it covers a dozen countries, half a dozen languages. How do you go about starting on a book like this? How do you decide what resources you need to look at when you can rely on secondary research, what you need to read in the original and what you can rely on in translation? And do you start with a thesis before you begin the book, or do you allow that to emerge out of your research?
No, I didn't start with a thesis. I allowed that to emerge. And I mean, I think that to give a proper answer to your question, I would need to show you these. I bought a sort of sketchbook, which is about this big, and then wrote in tiny letters, endless cloud diagrams. And sometimes the entire thing is filled with arrows and clouds and puffs and pointy bits and round bits and so on in different coloured pens as I tried to work out. But that was for each chapter. Each chapter had to be structured like that. From the very beginning, I thought of it as a story with many voices. So I wanted to, I wanted to hear the voices of the people who made 1848 happen, and that seemed to be important because the people who created and carried out this revolution and who suffered in it and risked everything in it and benefited from it in many cases, they didn't wait for us to come along and tell their story. They were very voluble, very garrulous. They all shared their stories. Many of them go into print. There are huge numbers of memoirs and historical works that come from people who were directly taking part. And people fought on barricades, ministers, the Merz minister, the March ministers brought into power as a result of the revolutions, but also counter-revolutionaries, all writing about their emotional state, how they experienced each passing day, in some cases keeping diaries, and then you have the newspapers and so on, which record the events with the most granular detail you can imagine. So this is a very talkative, a very communicative revolution. And I wanted to capture that sort of cacophony of competing voices in the book. So that was part of what I knew that I wanted to do from the very beginning. And above all, I wanted it to be a book about that made sense of the European scale of revolutions and didn't get lost, didn't fetishize the difference between one national theatre and another. Because, you can turn it into a great riddle. In fact, we used to ask this question in Cambridge in the history track course. We used to ask, account for the simultaneity of revolution in 1848, which is a fair enough question. But I mean, it's just as difficult to explain the simultaneity of a revolution in Paris as it is to explain the simultaneity of revolution, or in Germany, as it is to explain the simultaneity of revolution at the European scale. Why not just acknowledge that Europe is the unit of analysis and stop worrying about the fact that this event happened at the same time in so many different places, just as it happened in many parts of Paris at the same time, and many parts of the German states, of the Deutsche Bund at the same time, or of the Austrian Empire. And so the third point I'd make is that I wanted not to shy away from the complexity of 1848. And I know complexity can be off-putting. I remember when I was at school, our teacher telling us, this is in Sydney, Australia, the teacher telling us, boys, the 1848 revolutions were complicated and they were a failure. And I remember thinking that's a very unattractive combination. But in fact, they were certainly complicated. They most certainly were not a failure. The judgment that they're a failure falls drastically short of understanding their impact. But they were complicated. But the idea of the book is to teach people, not teach people, but to encourage people to learn to love the complexity. Because we're living with complexity in our own lives. We live with it in our own world. The world is getting more complicated with every passing minute. And so one of the lessons of 1848, it seems to me, is, if you're trying to understand a complex event, you're not wasting your time.
A lot of histories of 1848 begin with sketching out Europe as bequeathed by the Congress of Vienna and the Treaty of Paris in 1850. And this was the post-revolutionary, post-Napoleonic settlement. And the 1848 revolutions are often symbolized by the flight of Metternich from Vienna, who had been one of the key participants in the Congress of Vienna. Interestingly, your book starts instead with a detailed analysis of the social conditions of Europe in the pre-1848 period. And there's clearly references scattered through the book to things related to the Congress of Vienna, but there's no systematic analysis of the Congress of Vienna as a starting point. Why did you decide to take that approach?
Well, the main reason is that when I was first writing the book, I imagined that I would have a chapter. I mean, I had a chapter called it's actually not a chapter, a section of a chapter called The Forever Peace, which is about the 1815 settlement. My interest there was caught by the fact that the 1815 settlement begins with a peripatetic group of foreign ministers, sometimes joined by sovereigns, but mostly not, moving across in the van in the rear of these massive armies which are pushing Napoleon back into France. So they're effectively crossing a crime scene on a massive scale, and you know, the letters and notes of Metternich, and especially the correspondence with his women friends, is very, very, very eloquent on the subject of the horror and the suffering of a battlefield shortly after it had been vacated by the armies. The carnage, the piles of corpses, the screaming horses disemboweled by shells, the stench. I mean, he goes into great detail in this. So that kind of traumatic opening experience of the Napoleonic Wars, followed by an effort to create a peace that would be forever, that would, as it were, a system of tranquility, as Metternich called it. That was going to be one of the centerpieces of the book, but the book got so long that I then decided I needed to keep those chapters, not just that one, but also a chapter on the revolutions of the 1820s and the turbulence of Europe in the 18 teens and so on, to keep that for another book. But nevertheless, the 1815 crops up all the time, as you say, in the 1848 book, because the people caught up in this revolution did feel that they were at the end of a 33-year period, what they thought of as servitude or the Metternich system. They were very critical of this peace. And so it was a complex achievement, and in retrospect, we're inclined, I think, to be rightly so, to be more generous to the peacemakers than perhaps the people of 1848 were. But certainly they saw its flaws very clearly.
Yeah. Clearly the period between 1815 and 1848 wasn't a period of uninterrupted peace. There were huge numbers of riots, of assassination attempts, some successful, some not. But arguably the biggest revolution prior to 1848 in that period was in 1830, where Belgium was created out of the Netherlands, where the Polish rebelled and then were suppressed by the Russians. If you compare 1830 with 1848, there's a very different geography in terms of where the revolution spread, with the epicenters of 1848 being in the Italian states, in the German Confederation, in France, in Austria-Hungary, but not in Belgium, not in what had been Poland, and not very much in Scandinavia or the northern countries. How do you account for that different geographical spread between the two revolutions?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, even 1848 doesn't have a stable geographical spread because it changes, it has several phases, and the epicenter of revolution is constantly moving. I think that what's interesting about the relationship between 1830 and 1848 is this sense that a revolution has been attempted in some places, as you mentioned in Belgium and in France, and also in some of the Swiss cantons. For example, you have new cantonal constitutions, so you have a successful revolution. But what a lot of people feel after 1848 is that this is not enough, that the revolution is being stolen by the people who made it, the liberals. Although what they often say is that the people who actually made 1830 possible were the working people, the people who were suffering under the pressure of these various social questions that were gnawing away at people's welfare in Europe. So the feeling gained ground that this is a sort of, as the French call it, révolution escamotée, a sort of stolen, hijacked revolution, hijacked by sort of bourgeois liberals, stolen from the people who had made the revolution possible. And this sense of frustration about the limits of what has been achieved by 1830 creates a sort of builds up a potential which will be ventilated by the events of 1848. But I'm just trying to think now about your question about geography, which is not an easy one. I mean, it's true. I think it's true that in some cases, if you have a revolution already accomplished, like the Belgian one, then a nimbus can surround that constitutional order, which makes a further revolution difficult. And that was the case in Belgium, where people were shy about completely ditching a system which only recently had been so heroically established.
On the other hand, the French system also been re-established.
Exactly. That's right, but there's a difference, and that is that in the case of the French system, after all the fighting, which after all was over in 3 days, it was the Trois Glorieuses, and after that the revolution was finished, and what they then got was not really a new constitution like the Belgians, whose constitution was admired, the world around. They got the Charte révisée, which is a sort of slightly changed, slightly altered version of the old constitution, the Charte constitutionnelle of 1814. And yes, it's true, the franchise expanded, but only from a portion of 1.3% to 2.2% or something like that. So it was still a nano franchise in which only the very wealthiest were included. And so, although there were considerable achievements, there were very liberal achievements. They were very moderate, very gradualist. They corresponded to the worldview of these people called the doctrinaire, whose leader was Guizot, actually in many ways very intelligent and sympathetic figure who presided over a France which was changing as little as possible in order to avoid the tumult. It turned out that as little as possible was not enough.
Before the French Revolution of 1791, there had been 3 years of bad harvests, and there was also a very bad European harvest in 1846. But what I find interesting about your book is that you make the point that the harvest itself was not directly the trigger for the revolution. It was the second order effect by suppressing demand and putting a lot of the urban artisans out of work. So my question for you would be, to what extent you see 1848 as primarily an urban-led revolution rather than a rural-led revolution?
That's a very interesting question, and what you say is exactly right, that the strain brought to bear by the harvest of 1846 was terrible, and coupled of course with the potato blight, which had such horrific effects in Ireland, brought about mass death through famine of 1 million people, an eighth of the population. So that was appalling, but what actually matters more for 1848 in some ways is the fact that after that you have knock-on effects in the manufacturing and business sectors which directly affect artisans in the cities. So that means you have a reservoir of people who are very disaffected, who don't have much to do, or are often being told there's no work until the autumn, they should not bother coming back to wherever they work, and so on. And that's a very dangerous potential. And of course we know that in Paris, one of the first things the new government does is to create national workshops in which workers who don't have work can be paid a minimal dole each day for doing various tasks which are not of much intrinsic value. So that's true, there are these two phases. But it is, by and large, I mean, there are outbreaks of violence and there are tumults in the countryside right across Europe. But in terms of the revolution as a process that generates new forms of representation, that is capable of convening in Parliament, drawing up a constitution. Constitutions were central breathing documents at the heart of this revolution. One of the things I try and communicate in the book is how interesting constitutions are and how important they are, and how it's not a waste of time for people who may or may not be professors to stand in a Parliament and spend time drawing up, laboriously drawing up a complex document like a constitution. But nevertheless, in as much as the revolution is about that kind of thing and about urban clubs and so on, it is an urban event. And one of the tragedies of the revolution is the difficulty that revolutionaries based in cities have in trying to establish a connection with the various forms of discontent in the countryside. There is lots of discontent out there. There's lots of violence. There's illegal land occupations, attacks on country houses, and so on. What's difficult is to give any of that a political form. And I remember being very struck by a report by a French commissaire révolutionnaire who was sent out from Paris to communicate the value of the revolution to some peasants in, I've forgotten where he was, no, Languedoc or something like that. And he wrote back and said, look, I explained to them the glories of our constitution and the parliament and how important it all is and what we're achieving. And they looked at me completely uncomprehending. And I asked them what were they concerned about, what did they want us to achieve, and they started talking about some pigs and a forest. And he said, and from this I conclude that the people in the country have no idea of politics whatsoever. But of course, pigs and forests are what politics is about if you live in a small village in Languedoc. So, they just didn't get it. And there's a marvellous Austrian commentator on these issues, a man called Kudlik, who was a sort of agrarian radical, who wrote brilliantly about this. And at the end of his memoirs of the revolution, he also was the youngest member of the Austrian Reichstag, established during that year. At the end of his memoirs, he says it's no wonder the peasants didn't rise, because you can't go out and speak to the peasants the way you would speak to a club full of clever lawyers in Salzburg. You've got to speak to them about the things that matter. And above all, you have to sit down and listen to them. And that's what the revolution failed to do.
The insights that I found most interesting was your argument that it was the revolution that made the revolutionaries and not the other way around. What do you think it was that accounted for the absence of revolutionary planning in the lead up to the revolution?
That's another great question. Well, I think there were people who were planning a revolution. They tended to be people of the very hard left. But their vision of a revolutionary transformation was not widely shared. In fact, most people in most of these countries were horrified by the idea of a revolutionary dictatorship, which would disturb or perhaps even transform and revolutionize the order of property, for example. And so they were always a small, very acquired taste in the outer reaches of the far left. And what's interesting is that those people, when revolution happens, it's not because they planned it, they've had nothing to do with it, and they are completely caught by surprise, and they by and large remain totally marginal to the way the revolution plays out. So it's those revolutionaries who had been thinking about how to plan an insurrection, they play no role whatsoever. The people at the center of the events are people who have not planned anything, but who feel very quickly that they are called to inherit the situation of the revolution. They do this because they're already public people, or because they fought in a city and they feel that they deserve something in return for their sacrifice, or they've seen friends shot on barricades and so on. But they're not people who planned anything. So in a curious way, the revolutionaries are just as surprised by the revolution as the people who are trying to contain it. And that's one of the curious things. It may be the case that for most revolutions, it may be the case that most revolutions make revolutionaries rather than the other way around.
In the heyday of the revolution in the spring of 1848, a lot of the process seems to be driven by crowds in large cities. And what I was struck by your narrative was how seemingly accidental the behaviour of crowds was. So in in Palermo, as you mentioned, the revolution got triggered by a prankster, Agnasco, putting up a poster. In Berlin, a few months later, it was a couple of grenadiers letting off their rifles by accident, which turned the mood of the crowd ugly. Do you think that these, as it were, butterfly effects meant that the revolution was inherently unpredictable in terms of the course it took, or was the underlying problems such that these sort of sparks would have happened anyway and would have led to a revolution in any case?
Well, the interesting thing about these events is exactly as you say. I mean, Peter's referring to the fact that in Palermo, a poster appeared saying there's going to be a revolution in a few days, on the 12th of January. Siciliani, you'll be free. This is your moment, to break your chains and so on. And signed Comitato Rivoluzionario. And of course, there wasn't a revolutionary committee. This guy had just printed the thing himself and started the war. But on the 12th, people came out to the streets to see what was going to happen. So, of course, did troops in triple strength, because the authorities were expecting trouble on that day for obvious reasons. And with the troops and the crowds in the same streets, something bad was bound to happen. What's interesting about this is that it's not as chancy and contingent as it looks, because almost everywhere we find, as you say, similar conditions of spontaneous combustion, and that suggests that it's not just a sequence of completely random accidents, that there are structural issues there, and one of them is the profound hostility between troops and civilians, which is a present characteristic of all the European capitals. Truppenhaus is something you hear chanted by the crowds almost everywhere in the German states. And attacks on soldiers, but also attacks by soldiers on civilians. I mean, the hostility is mutual, and so it's not surprising that when large crowds congregate for one reason or another, and then troop concentrations are called, or troops concentrate at key nodal points of the city, that there's going to be trouble. Many of these troops are not well trained by contemporary standards, not well trained for dealing with civil tumults. And there's also no kind of there's no, as there is today, a sort of sliding scale where you have police and then more police and then more police, and then if things get really bad, you might bring in the United States, bring in the National Guard or whatever. You have to sort of, you go from 0 to 100% in very short order, and that also creates the potential. But that's the case everywhere, the potential for violence. So I think there are structural features, and what's really striking about the revolutions is how similar they are. You know, they all use, the emerging elites use very similar language. They want very similar things. This is a very joined up continent, and the elites are very European in their awareness, perhaps even more so than today's European elites.
One of the factors that makes it so joined up is the extraordinary rapid spread of information about the revolution. So the Palermo revolution takes place on the 12th of January. By the 27th, de Tocqueville is already warning the Chambre de Députés in Paris that this could be a European-wide revolution. And yet this was an era where certainly the telegraph and Morse code had been patented in the 1830s. Isambard Kingdom Brunel had launched his big steamship around at the same time. The Paris-Brussels Railway had opened in 1846, I think, but there was still information technology was pretty much in its infancy. So what do you think accounted for this extraordinary rapid spread of the revolutions from one place to another? And how did people actually get to hear about it?
I think most people got to hear about it through well, it depends over what scales which scales we're talking about. People hear about the revolution in other states, mainly through the press. But if you are connected to mercantile networks, often it's people who are buying and trading things who hear first. They learn through mercantile correspondence before it appears in the press, and sometimes they do that incredibly fast because they're dealing with couriers who are in courier networks. If we're talking about the link between countryside and city, there it's the fact that peasants go into towns in order to sell goods at markets and so on, and when they come out they say that you've got no idea what's going on in Paris right now or in Berlin right now and so on. There's a very famous moment in Bismarck's memoirs where he recalls being told by a neighbour what had happened in Berlin, and then summarizing, he hadn't read it in the press, and then summoning the peasants to ask what they think. So people find out about this through formal and informal networks. But it is astonishing how quickly the news, what's the word for, propagates across space. And in some cases it seems to have propagated so quickly it's hard to explain, given the state of information technology at the time, how it could move so fast. And I think what this suggests is that we shouldn't always be thinking in diffusionist terms about the revolution. The revolution diffusing from troubled spots out into areas which are not troubled. Rather, the whole continent is a system of troubled spots, and they're all ready to go. They're all ready to pop, and so it doesn't take much to disinhibit the crowds to the point where a revolution can happen.
In Germany and in the German-speaking parts of Austria, perhaps the highlight of the revolution was the establishment of the Frankfurt National Assembly in May 1848, which then lasted about a year. And yet that foundered when Frederick William IV refused to accept a crown given to him by the Assembly. Why is it, do you think, that the delegates, particularly on the liberal side of the Assembly, were still so fixated on the idea of a monarchy and were not willing to go down the republican route as in France?
This is a question that today is sometimes addressed to Britain. Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's a very striking thing. Monarchism is constitutional monarchism is the default setting for reformist Europeans. By and large, there are some pockets of republicanism. In the southwest of Germany, there are quite strong republican networks, quite socially deep, but they're unusual, even in the German setting, in fact in the European setting generally. What people want is a better form of monarchy. And it's very striking if you think about that extraordinary piece of theatre that happens in Berlin, where after the shooting on the 18th and 19th of March, when you have over 300 corpses lying around around the barricades, and they get carried through to the centre of town. And what the revolutionaries do, as if instinctively, is they show the corpses to the king. They want the king to understand what's happened. And that sounds like a moment of intense confrontation, possibly even with the latent possibility of violence. But it's not. It's actually, they don't want to banish the king from their moral horizon. They want to make him understand what has just happened. And so they tell him, take off your cap. Somebody calls out, Mütze up, and he takes off his cap. And then the wounded, the dead, are rolled past or wheeled past the monarch and his wife, who are standing looking very ashen-faced at this horrific spectacle. And then somebody starts singing Jesus meine Zuversicht. Everybody joins in, including the king and his wife. And it's an extraordinary moment when it's as if a sort of storm has passed. And people feel that somehow something has been put to rights because the king understands. That's very extraordinary. It shows how deeply rooted the monarchy was, even in a city like Berlin, which was quite a turbulent place by 1848. France is unusual in having become, by 1848, in having become a country where republicanism is the default position. But in the other states, that's not at all the case.
In your chapter, which is entitled Entropy, you describe how the various factions of the revolution, particularly the liberals and the radicals, fall out in the wake of their immediate success. If you compare that with both the French and the Russian revolutions, they also had very sharp, sometimes murderous disagreements between, in the French case, the Girondins, the Montagnards, and in the Russian case between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. But those disagreements didn't imperil the revolution as such. So why was it that this liberal-radical split was so fatal to the success of revolutions in 1848?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I want to push back though a little bit at the idea that they didn't imperil the revolution. So I think in the case of Russia, no, that's true. If by revolution we mean the revolution planned and executed by the Bolshevik faction, and the one-party state established in the image of their ideology, then yes, that was a success for them. And of course, it imperiled all the other revolutions that could have happened. For example, an agrarian revolution dominated by the socialist revolutionaries, the SRs as they were called, who actually controlled, when they finally convened a parliament of sorts, they controlled the majority of the seats, or the Menshevik version of a revolution, or the liberal one, preferred by people like Prince Milyukov, and so on. In France, I think it's in Paris in 1789 to 1793-4, there again I think you can say that the division between the factions does imperil. It imperils the original revolution of the constitutional monarchy and replaces it with another revolution, which is the revolution of equality and fraternity and with the Jacobin dictatorship and so on. And that revolution is then itself dismantled by the Directory. So it's a complex picture of phases superseding each other. In 1848, I suppose, there was no single faction that was strong enough to sort of dominate the situation to the point where it could, as it were, create a fait accompli in the image of its own vision of a revolutionary success. And we'll have to add to that the fact that from the very beginning, liberals were terrified of public tumult. They were terrified of disorder, terrified of plebeian violence. I mean, who's not terrified of plebeian violence? It's hard to find anybody who relishes plebeian violence, but there was this problem that you never knew whether something was the revolution or was it just plain violence. People are setting fire to gas, famously around Vienna. One of the things that the workers did in the suburbs outside the city was to set light to the gas mains and create these great flaring sort of bonfires around the edge of the city, which could be seen for miles away. And people in the city ask themselves, is this a revolutionary act, or is it just the end of all things? Is it just meaningless, violent thuggery? And a lot of revolutionaries felt it was the latter. So you have this problem about where you draw the line between, plebeian tumult and revolutionary violence. And people often disagreed about where that line should be drawn. So that's part of the answer. And I suppose the final thing is that fear of violence and fear of disorder meant that the liberals were pretty early ready and willing to drop the revolution and to run back to a kind of accommodation with the old order, or with at least with the powers that had sustained the old order.
In the United Kingdom, you correctly point out that there were significant Chartist riots in 1848. And yet, if I've understood you rightly, you put the absence of a full-fledged revolution in the UK down to three factors, down to controlling food prices, down to more effective policing, and down to expelling potential revolutionaries. And I'd just like to push back on each of those three, because in the UK there was arguably the worst famine in the whole of Europe at the time, the Irish potato famine from 1855. In the continent, there may not have been so many police, but the armed forces, except in Baden, remained loyal to the states and were used to repress the revolutionaries. And in the pre-1848 period, it was remarkable how many revolutionaries, like Mazzini or Engels, were tolerated as exiles in the UK without doing very much. So the question I'd just like to ask is, do you really think there is no legitimacy in the argument that the Reform Act of 1832 effectively gave the liberal wing of what the revolutionaries on the continent were fighting for a lot of what they wanted, and therefore effectively decapitated the potential revolutionary movement in the UK?
No, I think there is something in that. And I think the 1832 Reform Act has an effect a bit like the 1830 revolution in Brussels. You know, it's the 1830-31 revolution in Belgium. It's a kind of refoundation of the state, which is deep importance for legitimizing the system. And I think that is one of the explanations, not the only one, why the British state is capable of mobilizing such immense voluntary support in support of itself when it's challenged by a movement like the Chartists. And I have in mind here the special constables. You know, if you think of that meeting on Kennington Common, in addition to all the Chartists, there were 80,000. I mean, it's a huge number of special constables armed with clubs and so on, who never had to go into action because it didn't end up being that kind of situation. But I suppose they could have if they had been ordered to. And among these special constables, by the way, was you know, the future Napoleon III, who joined up as a man of order to be part of that. So, I mean, I think I wanted to, I mean, that was in a way that observation that, you know, we're already liberal enough. A bit like parents saying, you know, our teenage children will never rebel against us because we're so permissive, you know, we're so nice. I wanted to get, that was the argument that people made at the time, and they said, you know, the reason why, you know, Europe's in flames, whereas everything's calm here, is because we're just better, right? But I wanted to, you know, also to push back a little bit against that, without denying the liberality of the British system by comparison with most of its continental counterparts. I wanted to push back against that for several reasons. The first was that Britain was, in fact, very robustly policed. It had far and away the best organized and largest police force of Europe, and I mean the civilian police force, used to dealing with civilian tumults. The Irish Constabulary was you know, ardently admired by the Prussians, who sent a fact-finding committee, fact-finding group in the summer of 1848 to Britain to find out how they kept Ireland quiet, and came back with detailed recommendations on how to improve Prussian policing. So Britain wasn't just seen as a liberal state, it was also seen as a vigorously and effectively policed state. Finally, I mean, it is, I think, important to think not just about 1832, but also about Peel's reforms, and the reform of the repeal of the Corn Laws, but also other reforms which had rationalized British politics and also made staple goods cheaper than they might otherwise have been, and thereby reduced revolutionary pressures. And the interesting thing about Peel is he becomes this, in the minds of those who are trying to put the systems back together again in Europe after 1848, he becomes this, you know, luminous figure. And it amazed me to see people standing up at the Cortes in Madrid, for example, and saying, "Yo soy un Peelista." You know, people thought of themselves as Peelists because they admired a man who was capable of embracing, you know, quite important structural reforms, although he was a conservative, and, you know, riding roughshod over his conservative colleagues, and getting into collusive arrangements with radicals and advanced Whigs and so on, in order to press forward with the reformist program. That has a deep impact on what happens after 1848.
In one of my favourite German poems, Torne by Annette von Dostoevsky, from 1842, she talks about how she wishes she was a man, a bit of a soldier, and as a woman can only secretly untie her hair and let it flutter in the wind. And in your book you document how many women were active both as instigators and organisers of the revolution, and also of chroniclers of what happened. And yet, interestingly, there was no demand amongst the revolutionaries for female emancipation, and even some of the women seemed to be against it. How do you explain the absence of a desire for female emancipation at the time?
Well, that's another very interesting question. Women were very divided about emancipation because emancipation had acquired an association with sexual license, and many middle-class women felt that emancipation would mean some kind of relaxation of morals, which they found repugnant and also embarrassing, and they didn't want to associate themselves with that. There was, of course, a discourse of emancipation, which was about political emancipation. It wasn't having no truck with issues of lifestyle, but there were also lifestyle, gurus and pioneers like Georges Sand, for example, who were actually living autonomous lives with lovers sometimes of both sexes, living very free and very self-steered lives, and demonstrating to other women what it meant to be an autonomous and emancipated woman. And that was a message that met with a mixed response from women who were more deeply embedded in the social framework. That's part of the answer. I think the much more important part, though, is simply that patriarchy was, and still is, very, very strong. And there is some very interesting commentary, which I talk about in the book, by women activists, both in 1848 and the run-up to 1848, who remarked that feudalism is on the way out, that even slavery, that ancient injustice is starting to sort of shake with the Reform Acts coming from the British Parliament, and so on, the Abolition Act, but that the desperate pushed hard directly against patriarchy and said, and I mean that in a non sort of screaming quotes way, when they pressed hard at the system of male superiority, they achieved nothing, because the system conceded absolutely nothing. So if you compare the different groups that press for a change in their circumstances, Jews, for example, for the first time, European Jews organized in the name of Jewish emancipation and of more general human emancipation. The first acts abolishing slavery in the French Empire are passed after the February Revolution by the new provisional government. So a great deal is achieved for enslaved Africans in the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, a great deal for Jewish citizens in the European states, but for women, really nothing.
In a moment, I'd like to open up to the floor. I'm just going to ask a couple of last questions of my own. So, you encourage people not to think in terms of success or failure of the revolutions, but more in terms of the effects that they have. And you make very ambitious claims for a number of the effects that they have. But what I was struck at the time was that most of the claims were political ones, in the sense that you say that the 1848 revolutions shaped the nature of Italian and German unification. Whereas I would have seen the lasting legacy of the 1848 revolutions being more a constitutional one, in that the constitutions introduced in Frankfurt, in Italy, in a number of other countries, are still reflected in the constitutions of today. And I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, partly it's a fault of the structure of the book, that I didn't want to save all the conclusions to the end. So I actually start thinking about the impact of things, in medias res, and so there's a section on the constitutions where at the end of which I say, that actually it's amazing how many constitutional systems of today date from 1848. The Swiss constitution is an effectively much amended and transformed version of the Swiss constitution of 1848. The Danish constitution of 1849 is still the Danish constitution, and the Danes celebrate its promulgation every June in a national holiday. And there are many other examples of constitutions that date back to 1848, and bits of the, as you say, bits of the Frankfurt Constitution survive, and the Weimar Constitution, and then in the Constitution of today's Federal Republic. So these are really fascinating documents, and they have a very long afterlife. You're absolutely right about that. I think that, you know, what I wanted to, the point I wanted to draw attention to at the end of the book, one of them was that, you know, it's not just that Germany unifies and that Italy unifies, it's also how these unifications come about reflects the patterns of 1848. And so we find that whereas in Germany all the states are involved in the revolution and also involved in learning from the revolution, you know, the Bavaria, Saxony, with a couple of exceptions, Hanover being one, but Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg and so on, all modernize and you know, invest in huge infrastructural investment programs after 1848 in order to keep up with the times, as it were. In Italy, that doesn't happen in the south, in the Papal States of the south, and as a consequence, Italy ends up being absorbed by Piedmont, whereas that never happens in Germany. Prussia never absorbs the rest of Germany. It becomes a genuine federation.
Yeah. One last question from me. You pepper the book with a lot of fascinating and sometimes funny modern-day references and comparisons. I particularly liked your description of Garibaldi's Dolce and Gabbana style. But you end the book at the very end by saying the people of 1848 could see themselves in us, and I just wondered if you'd like to explain what you meant by that.
Yes, well, you know, there's been a lot of debate now among my colleagues, and sometimes a slightly tiresome debate about, you know, how presentists should we be, how, you know, should we try and think of the past as a prequel to the present, or should we try and extract messages or understanding, forms of understanding for the present from the past, and so on. And it's all about, you know, how like us are they, and we're always looking back at them, and there's always this danger that one will simply see reflections of oneself in the past. I mean, an example might be Boris Johnson's book on Winston Churchill, in which he made the astonishing discovery that he and Winston Churchill are the same person.
Or Winston Churchill's book on Marlborough.
Or Winston Churchill's book on Marlborough. It goes on, and old Marlborough's book on goes on in infinite regress. But what I felt was, it's lost when we think about the question in that way, is how smart those people were, how thoughtful they were about what they were doing, and how aware they were of in some cases, of how disastrously their experiments had gone wrong, or how unexpected the outcomes were. If you think about what Marx writes about the revolution, Marx is an phenomenally sharp observer of these revolutions, and I don't mean in the great theoretical works, but in his political journalism, or the pieces he wrote with Engels and so on. Fantastic sort of, you know, moving threshold of observations as the revolution unfolds, always thinking hard and asking really hard questions about what this all means. So those people are thinking, you know, very actively about their past, present, and future. And what struck me, that's what I wanted to bring out at the end of the book, was this slightly spooky sense that, you know, when I looked at the QAnon shaman, you know, marching around saying freedom, you know, in the House of Representatives on the Capitol, you know, I thought this is so 1848. You know, and I felt in a way that I wanted to ask them, what do you think about this? You know, because they had already seen that. They'd seen chamber invasions, and they'd seen, you know, constitutions used to destroy constitutions, and parliaments deployed against parliaments, and they'd seen their hopes, you know, incinerated, and other people had seen, you know, wonderful outcomes unexpectedly generated out of the chaos and destruction of the revolution. So, you know, I just felt that they were smarter and more self-aware than we're often inclined to give them credit for.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. That's all from me.